Denis Halliday served between 1994-1998 as Assistant Secretary General of United Nations and was appointed by Secretary General Kofi Annan to the post of United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator in Iraq and Administrator of the Oil for Food Program as of 1st of September 1997. He resigned from his post in Iraq and from the United Nations as a whole in September 1998, protesting the economic sanctions and the inefficiency of the program. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Good morning, distinguished members of the jury. Good morning, friends. We've heard this morning specific, shocking violations of human rights and the use of illegal weapons, banned weapons, specifically depleted uranium, and the appalling health and human well-being impact that these weapons have had on the people, the children of Iraq. I was asked to present a more broad picture of the United Nations failure vis-à-vis Iraq, and that I will try to do. Since 1990, the people of Iraq have been the victims of a continuous United States, United Kingdom-driven United Nations Security Council aggression. Triggered by the Iraq takeover of Kuwait, this aggression on the Iraqi people cannot be justified. I say that in no way defending the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, for there can be no justification for such aggression. Instead, this view reflects UN rejection of peaceful withdrawal offers by Iraq. This was due to the determination of Washington to destroy Iraq's potential and violently overthrow the no longer useful friend and ally in Baghdad. The resulting 1991 UN-endorsed Gulf War, the war crimes committed in the name of the United Nations by US armed forces, set a pattern of militaristic aggression towards the people of Iraq that continues until today. The result has been massive loss of civilian life, some through political and military negligence, some intentional, as meets one essential ingredient of the definition of genocide. This primitive response by the United Nations to this founding member via deadly UN sanctions up until 2002 is now sadly sustained following the illegal invasion in 2003 and the military and ideological occupation by troops of Bush II and Blair. Since 1945, manipulated and corrupted by the 5 permanent members, the UN Security Council has often been brutally employed to serve the narrow interests of the powerful. This is as intended by the victors of the Second World War, if you read between the lines, in the Council's terms of reference as set out in the Charter. As I was reminded this morning by Thomas Fassi, the Charter was signed 60 years ago tomorrow. Maybe a moment of silence tomorrow would be appropriate. In one sense, the United Nations was structured to fail the people of Iraq and continues to do so. I refer to the so-called UN coalition, US-led, of the 1991 Gulf War, that destroyed civilian lives and infrastructure in breach of the Geneva Conventions and protocols, massacred thousands, and buried alive in mass graves hundreds of more Iraqi troops. The US leadership deployed that new nuclear weapon of choice, namely hundreds of tons of depleted uranium missiles and shells, which Thomas has explained to us so well, with horrific cancerous consequences still being revealed today. In addition, the UN silently accepted the totally illegal no-fly zone bombing by the United States and Britain of Iraq, culminating in, quote, softening up attacks, unquote, preliminary to the unlawful invasion of 2003. More than 12 years of genocidal sanctions constitute a massive breach of the UN Charter itself. I refer to Articles 1 and Articles 2 in particular, and underline the incompatibilities therein. By these various means, the UN has itself destroyed the basic human rights of the Iraqi people through the willful neglect of Articles 22 through 28 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The UN failed to protect and safeguard the children and the people of Iraq before and after 2003's invasion. And as rare but honest news coverage demonstrates, as Saul Landau explained to us yesterday, the UN continues to fail Iraq and its people, now in mid-2005, as this tribunal sits in Istanbul. Members of the jury, let's look at the US-UK invasion. With US invasion intentions announced, where were the UN voices of moral law and integrity? Where was the outrage? Where was the intervention of the Secretary General as per his obligations under UN Charter Article 99? Where were the many member states committed to protecting the United Nations Charter and tenets of international law? Given the form of the General Assembly and the power of the majority, where were the states prepared to stop the oil military strategic aggression blatantly being pursued by Bush and Blair? The answer is they were nowhere to be found nor to be heard. Respect for human rights and international law, including the Charter itself, was hidden by the polluted and murky world of self-interest among UN member states that favors a sweaty embrace of the Bush regime. The world watched Bush threaten the heads of state present in the General Assembly in September of 2002, and then saw he and Blair deceive all willing to be deceived. A deception culminating in General Powell lying to the Security Council in early 2003 about weapons of mass destruction and the danger, quote unquote, Iraq represented. We are asked to believe that the spirit of Article 51, dealing with national self-interest and defense, somehow justified US invasion of Iraq, as in the case of the invasion of Afghanistan. Blair informed us that Baghdad could surprise attack London in 45 minutes with terrible and illegal weapons. He forgot to point out that these chemical and biological weapons were sold to Iraq by the UK itself or by European and American friends when earlier Baghdad took on Iran, largely due to the urging and with the active support of Washington and London. To argue that the Security Council in early 2003 was courageous in refusing to endorse the intended US invasion is a nice thought, but nothing more. The UN was not, repeat, not enhanced by its action or lack thereof to protect the sovereign state of Iraq from raw military aggression. This was perhaps the lowest point reached yet by the UN in its short history. Even the tyranny of the veto did not save UN credibility, which might have been the case had the three remaining veto powers used that dictatorial device. They did not. And the failure of the remaining member states to walk out, resign, stand up and be counted was and remains simply disgusting. When 20 months later, the Secretary General remembered his responsibility to speak up under Article 99, he mumbled off record and was sadly far too late. Members of the jury, without the authority that resides in Article 42 of the Charter, and without a Security Council resolution providing for the specific use of force, the Bush-Blair invasion of Iraq is in complete breach of international law. The war crimes committed in that blatant military aggression, the most serious of international crimes, must be charged to Bush as the Commander-in-Chief and to Blair as the Prime Minister who abused war powers. Bush should be charged with use of state terrorism. I repeat, state terrorism, for the opening salvo of, quote, shock and awe bombing strikes on Baghdad, designed to terrorize by physically and mentally attacking a civilian population. This is the kind of state terrorism that provides a tragic reminder of the US nuclear crime of bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It is the kind of state terrorism besides which small-scale, quote, terrorist, unquote, resistance pales in comparison. However, both forms of terrorism are internationally unlawful and certainly, in my view, unacceptable. The UN member states listened mutely and swallowed, some painfully, the false arguments of Iraqi capacity to threaten not only its neighbors, none of whom seem to be particularly frightened, together with physical damage to the UK and the United States. The world tried desperately to believe the nonsense of massive stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And to top off the UK and US lies and rubbish was the charge of a close Iraqi linkage to, quote, al-Qaeda, unquote, and the attack on those twin towers, symbolic of Western capitalistic greed in New York in 9/11. To those who understand the secular nature of the Baghdad government and Ba'athist philosophy, and this supposed linkage broke the last straw of credibility. And the UN stood mutely by. Even to this day, the Security Council is unwilling to define terrorism for fear that state terrorism employed by its 5 permanent members would somehow be constrained. Thus, members of the jury, the March 2000 invasion took place in breach of all known international laws, executed with the application of terrorism and commission of war crimes, including further and massive use of depleted uranium, as we have heard already this morning. The UN, its member states, its Secretary General failed to employ all possible means to protect the people of Iraq. Worse, the UN was generally seen around the world to have been acquiescent and collaborative. Ironically, at the same time, in the United States, Americans were outraged that the Security Council of the United Nations had not supported its foreign policy and their self-serving military aggression. In regard to UN collaboration, I'd like to say something. Whereas the invasion was in breach of law, although eased by the acquiescence of the UN, and was globally condemned, the occupation was, on the other hand, more readily accepted as a new, if unlawful, reality. The occupation was supported by member states and donor agencies, then actively supported by the UN itself. That support and active involvement constitutes collaboration. And UN collaboration with the occupying enemy was and is a tragic mistake. Collaboration of this kind is unacceptable, an unacceptable role for the United Nations. We're all familiar with the rights of Iraqi self-defense and Iraqi resistance, as set out in Charter Article 51. We are equally familiar with the often murderous consequences of collaboration, which the French resistance made famous, even bizarrely glorious, under occupation in the 1940s. There is nothing glorious about killing, be it the enemy or one's own countrymen and women who decide, for whatever reason, to collaborate. There was and is nothing glorious about UN collaboration in Iraq, and nothing glorious about the consequence, the deadly truck bombing of the UN office building in Baghdad, on 19 August 2003. The Security Council, and particularly the Secretary General, responsible for the welfare of staff, appear to have failed to understood that the UN was, even before collaboration, the most hated organization in Iraq. Why? Well, why not? After 12 years of deadly United Nations sanctions that cost Iraq over 1 million lives, mostly children, followed by conspicuous collaboration with a common Iraqi enemy, that is, the American and British occupying forces, and after 12 years of humiliation and loss of dignity under UNSCOM's intrusive search for weapons of mass destruction. Why are we surprised? The Secretary General and his staff were obliged to remain apart from the illegal occupation, at best on standby, unless invited by a legitimate Iraqi government to assist, and there was none remaining in Iraq after the unlawful overthrow of the Baghdad government. The UN had no place in the country. The UN had no mandate to be in Iraq. A demand from Washington or London does not constitute legitimate invitation. Puppet regimes cannot be recognized by the United Nations, even if set up by 2 permanent member states of the Security Council. Airlifting of long expatriated Iraqis with armed thugs and mercenaries simply is not an entity that the United Nations can work with. However, it considered the occupation, even unlawful occupation, it's considered that obligations apply. Such obligations include the rule of domestic law, the protection of state and private property, and perhaps most importantly, the protection and well-being of the civilian population. The occupation forces have failed. They allowed, even facilitated, as we heard this morning, a complete breakdown in law and order. They stood back as looting and destruction of cities and towns took place. As days became weeks and months, they neglected to meet the basic needs of the people, including for food, housing, water, power, healthcare, education, and employment. And tragically, the gutless United Nations stood back silently as the Americans and British created anarchy. The UN remained silent as the occupiers disbanded Iraqi defense forces, including border guards, thereby opening the country up to intrusion and looting by thousands intent on chaos. In addition to the cost of Iraqi civilians, well-being, their lives, the intruders who came to attack the common enemy, that is, the intrusive and hated American armed forces, the fearsome crusaders of aggressive and righteous Bush Christian fundamentalism. Again, the UN failed. Effectively, the UN was gagged. Before the Iraqi economy could even begin the process of rebuilding, sanctions and military invasion being the cause of the collapse, the occupiers abolished the Oil for Food program, leaving a population without the resources, the income, the wherewithal to sustain their families in a situation of economic collapse, and in fact in a situation of massive inflation. For the first time in many years, the dreadful possibility of civil war has now been created by foreign intervention, foreign occupation. Like an old colonial regime, the occupation has discovered the benefits of divide and rule, with disastrous results. As a diversion from its own disastrous occupation and the mistakes I'm trying to cover without going beyond the time, Washington has attacked the Oil for Food program, but that is perhaps another story. So in conclusion, distinguished members of the jury and friends of this tribunal, we find in Iraq today almost total political and social chaos. Foreign military occupation has influenced interim arrangements that are not representative and have not the confidence of many Iraqis. We find chaos and misery for the Iraqi people, made homeless by brutal US and UK military action in civilian areas and towns, such as we've seen in the neighborhoods of Baghdad and in Fallujah, with horrific civilian casualties. And this, in fact, constitutes collective punishment of civilians. For the survivors, homelessness, unemployment, little means to survive have resulted. Healthcare is in disarray, and as we've heard, a general collapse of education, personal security, and other aspects of living a proper, normal, balanced life. And despite the courage of many Iraqis to vote under these near impossible conditions, we still have a problem of replacing a system of government. The national institutions are in a very bad state. We understand that the Constitution is being worked upon under American presence and possibly interference. I expect this will be largely rejected, and that once Iraq is free of military and foreign occupation, they themselves will have to rework this Constitution. I fear also that the IMF will get its hands on Iraq, and it will lead to structural adjustment that will destroy the remaining strengths of the welfare system that the Iraqi people have learned to depend on over many years. And due to the corruption of the Security Council, the abuse of the Charter, the situation has not led to a condemnation by the United Nations. Outrageously, the US and the UK continue to enjoy the benefits of member states' permanent seating, veto power in the Security Council. They have stolen and abused limited Iraqi resources, and yet there is no way to keep them quiet or suppress their role. The UN has watched the loss of life in Iraq. The UN has watched the war crimes of US and UK forces. Over 100,000 civilians have lost their lives in the invasion and now the occupation. And having tragically weakened Iraq and its people under 12 years of sanctions, the UN has taken no action to stop, condemn, or punish the blatant transgressions of the Charter, the human rights of the Iraqi people, and the provisions of international law. The world has witnessed a most serious set of international crimes. And it's essential, clearly, for the Iraqi people to be returned the right of ruling and governing their own country, for only they understand the needs of Iraq, only they can determine what is required to make this country again back into a free and safe environment for the people of Iraq to enjoy and grow. In the meantime, this tribunal has an opportunity, I think it's an obligation, to demand full international prosecution of US, UK invasion leaders and war criminals involved in the destruction of Iraq, the lives of its people, their human rights and well-being, through unlawful and unjustifiable armed invasion. Nothing less, if domestic impeachment or domestic prosecution fails, nothing less than international prosecution is acceptable. As we say in Turkish, hesap ver Bush, hesap ver Blair. Those dangerous men must be held accountable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denis. Thank you. And thank you all our speakers. I think there is some time. We have maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes. We feel very generous today. So 15 minutes for the juries if they have questions to the panels.
All right, perhaps I can start. I want to first address our Japanese, the testimony of the Japanese. You talked about a variety of issues, and some of them seem to me to be domestic, such as Article 9, and others seem to be perhaps unrealistic. For example, stopping the deployment of troops from Okinawa, from an American Okinawan base to Iraq. And maybe these are more appropriately thought of as domestic issues for Japan. But what I want to ask you is, in viewing Japanese leadership with regard to the war against Iraq, how would you have the jury treat Koizumi and any others that you might mention? I don't know if you want, so far you've only mentioned one person, the Prime Minister, but how would you have us treat him? At the same level as Bush and Blair, or at some different level? And this is a very serious question because it applies not only to Koizumi and other Japanese leaders, but to the entire leadership of the so-called coalition of the willing. And so I would like very much to have your proposal with regard to what level of accountability they should be held, such a person as Koizumi should be held to, not domestically, but internationally. And secondly, I want to ask you, Denis Halliday, in your remarks about the United Nations, it seems, well, first there was some acts of commission, such as the sanctions, which you describe as genocidal, that perhaps have some criminal intent and responsibility attached. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. But also you describe acts of omission, failure to act on the part of the Secretary General and on the part of other members of the Security Council to step up and try to oppose the action or failure, the action of the United States and the United Kingdom and the coalition of the willing in Iraq. And again, I would ask the same question of you with regard, on the one hand, to acts of commission regarding the sanctions. How would you have us treat that? How would you have the jury treat that? And with regard to acts of omission, how would you have us treat that? Is it something more than expressing, taking note? Is there something beyond taking note of a failure to act that you would ask us to consider? Thank you.
Can we have the questions first, and then we'll have the answers all together, yeah? Okay.
My question is to Denis Halliday. The sanctions against Iraq actually took place over a period of more than a decade. And we all keep mentioning Bush and Blair, but the fact is that it was overseen by the governments of Bill Clinton. We had Madeleine Albright's famous statement about the fact that when she was asked about 100,000 children having died because of the sanctions, she said it was a hard price, but they thought it was worth it. I just wondered whether we could just discuss the issues of real criminal culpability. Because what happens with organizations like the UN is that eventually individuals who are participating in this, what Mr. Halliday has called genocidal sanctions, don't you think that this jury should actually be thinking of criminal culpability of people who are actually doing this in the name of duty? They can't just be allowed to continue to hide behind the institution that they work for. And that is, I think it's very important for us all to realize that it isn't just Bush and Blair, but even the Democratic government in the United States, which was overseeing both the bombing, the softening up of Iraq, as well as the sanctions.
My question is for Denis. You spoke about the process going on of so-called democratization, new government, preparation of elections, etc., and which has been now promoted and I think accepted by the United Nations. However, you stress the point that the occupation is illegitimate. So what do we have to think about this process? If a constitution is in elaboration, but under the pressure of a foreign occupation, what is the value of this, and what are the meaning of the majority of the people locally?
I would like to direct my question to Thomas Faizi, who said that possible at the moment to establish a cause and effect relation between the depleted uranium weapons and the rising incidence of cancer and birth defects in the children. After the Chernobyl disaster, for example, the International Atomic Energy Commission was very deeply involved in the investigation of the cause and effect relations between that and the health problems that were eventually encountered in the Ukraine and in the vicinity of Chernobyl. What would be needed to establish such a cause and effect relation? Could international agencies be induced to undertake the necessary surveys in the region to establish such a cause and effect relation? Thank you.
Ben de bununla bağlantılı bir soru sormak istiyorum Thomas
I also
Faizi'ye.
have a related question for Thomas Faizi.
Birincisi o şeyler ne kadar sağlıklıydı, o koşullarda ne derece sağlıklı alınabildi o bilgiler. İkincisi bir de 2001 yılında bitiyordu. Acaba 2004-2005 yılına doğru eğri aynı şekilde yükseliyor mu? Uranyumdan etkilenen çocukların durumu ile ilgili.
Do we still have a mounting trend as regards the increase in children affected by depleted uranium in cancer cases?
Tati Almeida de Argentina. Ante la carestía total de medicamentos, ¿no se presta para el mercado negro con los invasores? Porque supongo que a ellos, a los invasores, no les faltan medicamentos.
Her name is Teti Almeida, and her question is as follows. In view of the total lack of medical resources, is there a growing black market for these medical resources? She supposes that the U.S. invading forces are not in any kind of lack of medical resources, and would be interested to know if you know of any incidences of black market